So I'm Bradley Sumrall, curator of the collection of the Ogden Museum of Southern Art, and I'm here today with Sheldon Scott, a DC artist, a native of South Carolina, whose performance video, Portrait Number 1 Man, Day Clean to Sundown, is currently on view at the Ogden Museum of Southern Art, and is a new acquisition made possible through the generosity of Dale Mott and Ken Isle. So we're very, very proud to be stewards for this extremely important piece of work. Thank you, Sheldon, for being here.
Thank you for having me.
We're here in the Ogden Museum's historic Richardsonian Romanesque library on the ancestral lands of the Chitimacha in the city of New Orleans. And this is the second day of spring, 2021. So very excited to be here. Thanks for being here. But before we begin, I'd just like to read a little description of this work and the artist who created it. Portrait Number 1 Man, Day Clean to Sundown, is a performance film by DC artist Sheldon Scott. With this work, Scott uses his own body to create a portrait of his ancestors, enslaved people from the Gullah Geechee region of the Southeastern U.S. The 12-hour and 20-minute film documents an endurance performance by the artist, in which he processes rice grains individually with his hands. Through using his own body to represent an entire community of people, Scott restores humanity to the narrative of slavery in the American South. To quote the artist, "From sun up until sundown, the body will hull and winnow rice grains and then place the whole grains one by one on a tomb-like vessel lined with burlap until the weight and value of the vessel equals that of the body laboring to fill it." He explains, "This rhythmic, inane process will communicate the transactional and the incalculable." Native of Pawleys Island, South Carolina, Scott is a former psychotherapist and professional storyteller, and his fine art practice is primarily focused on performance and video installation. He mines his experiences growing up in the Gullah Geechee South and his tenure in a mental health practice to examine the black male form and expectations of usability and expendability as they relate to constructs of race, economics, and sexuality. Portrait Number 1 Man, Day Clean to Sundown, explores some of the most pressing social issues facing the nation and the region today: race, place, white supremacy, and the brutal history and lasting legacy of slavery. The film also features a score from iconic singer-songwriter and composer Tamar Khalid, and features the cinematography of critically acclaimed filmmaker and artist John Cesare Goff. Portrait Number 1 Man, Day Clean to Sundown was included in the exhibition, The Outwind 2019 American Portraiture, today at the Smithsonian's Natural Portrait Gallery, and now at the Ogden Museum of Southern Art. So Sheldon, just to get this started, I was wondering, when did the concept for this piece arrive to you, and how did it develop?
So I first started exploring the kind of ancestral physical space where my foremothers were enslaved back in 2011, maybe 2011, 2012, because at that point I've been living in Washington, D.C. for about 10 years and traveling home infrequently, and I was really interested in what was happening at Brook Green Gardens. And when I went to the website, I saw that they had a series of tours, and one of the tours was the graveyard of the enslaved. And the first grave that was there, the first marker, was actually my grandmother, my maternal grandmother. And I thought I was fascinated. I had not known that my grandmother had been buried in this historic place. I was very unaware of that history, and it really sparked a new kind of intrigue and inquiry for me, thinking about like what it means to grow up in the same space where your people were enslaved, and what kind of connection that meant. And at the time, my practice was focused on storytelling, which we understand in the Gullah Geechee region as griot culture, and just figuring out a way to work that in, and then eventually found my way into performance art and visual arts practice, and that's kind of where I first started to figure out how do I unravel these pieces of that history. So it started then. I think the idea really for this particular piece took shape maybe 5 to 6 years later, like around 2016, 2017, when I was really interested in understanding that space as a labor camp, which is something we, in terms of language, we very rarely use I think the appropriate terminology when we describe these places. Most often we describe them as like idyllic plantations and beautiful spaces, and it's the kind of place that you'd want to get married. And what I was really interested in is like, well, let's do a deeper dive into what the true origin of this physical space meant, and the pain that it actually held. So starting to look at that place as a labor camp and not as like this beautiful outdoor sculpture garden that we were experiencing at the time. And then that's where the narratives of brutality really started to kind of come to the top for me, and started to look at how do I create a practice, a meditation on race right now that really restores that history and maybe evolves the conversation about race in this country.
Before I get to the next question, your mention of brutality, and can you talk a little bit about the physical acts that you're performing in this video? You made a choice not to have the kind of brutal husking of the rice.
Mm-hmm.
And can you tell us about that choice and then how that led you to the actual hand shelling of the rice?
So the first time I actually explored this public in a public dialogue was a piece as a part of the National Portrait Gallery's Identify series, Performance as Portraiture. And in that process, I created a dialogue between kind of the tenderness and the sense of humanity, like a hint of humanity, with the planting of these like very delicate rice plants that I had grown with the Smithsonian Garden Museum and planted throughout the entire institution. And then on the third floor of that museum, in that same space, I invited the audience to participate in the very brutal part of the winnowing of the rice and just like beating it down. And I think for like the hour or so I was doing that, a part of the, got very emotional for me because, I realized that I was actively mimicking, the brutality that my ancestors' bodies experienced. It's like hundreds and hundreds of thousands of rice grains, none of them having any significant identity of their own in this like shared space of trauma, and I'm literally just beating the brown off of it until it became white. And it set off a series of thoughts for me. And when I came back to this opportunity, what I wanted to do is offer as much restorative humanity I could to every ancestor that has ever been a part of that brutal narrative. So the very delicate process of peeling each grain of rice hand by hand and then gently placing them into this container, which could represent some safety or some soft landing that obviously they did not have, was very important to me. So just and I think that's it's a part of the meditative practice of it. Actually taking that time to peel each one off and with a tenderness afford them some sense of humanity that they may not have had at that time.
That decision that you made also gives the viewer a sense of the incalculable labor involved in enslavement in these labor camps. And it also put a lot of stress upon your own body in this performance. What did you do to prepare for? I think this was over 90 hours, over 3 days, the original, or the filming of this?
So the filming was straight. I think filming days are probably 13 hours.
13 hours?
For that one day, nonstop. The performance that was mounted as a part of the Outland Bushi for National Portraiture Prize was I think 78 hours over eight days. I followed the schedule of the enslaved, sun up to sundown, and Sundays were off. So I started on Saturday, had off Sunday, and then worked that Monday through that following Saturday. That process, as many of my performance art pieces are designed to fail. I mean, they are at their core, inane, impossible, and what I hope they do is they kind of serve as a portal or access point to the understanding of what Black existence could be like, and how it's just like to have your existence tied to such impossible feats on a daily basis. So that really was the idea of like bringing in, and when you read the description about it equaling the weight, I could not imagine the amount of time it would actually take for me to get to that. But I set it as a serious goal, because if I don't commit to it as an artist, I'll never be able to communicate it to the audience. I tell people it's the distinction between performance art and theater. So to prepare my body for that physically, I'll be 45 this year. So I think when I first took it on, I was like 43, and I went through occupational and physical therapy for 6 months prior to the performance to be able to handle that much time on my knees, and then that much time with the very repetitive and small movements of peeling the rice. So it was about 6 months of getting myself prepared for that exercise, which is, I tell people I think I went into it physically prepared. However, I did not do the mental preparation for that work.
I was just going to ask that. We can see the physical strength that it would have upon your body, but you were not allowed to speak during that time. You did not allow yourself to speak nor make eye contact. Was that one of the most difficult parts of the performance, or?
Yeah, definitely was a very challenging set of circumstances, and it was, one of those. It was a very calculated choice, because I think, as audiences came up and experienced this body in this space, the thing that they want to do, which is, really interesting, is like they want some sense of humanity. Like they want to connect, they want those sensibilities, they want those cues to know that there's another human being in the room with them, and that they want to connect under this like shared human experience, which is performative for the most part, because I don't honestly believe that most people care that much about connecting with humanity. But in a space like that, like in a museum where you're being watched by other people, I think you feel pressure to perform that. But what I really wanted the audience to do is examine how easy it is and how comfortable they are with like the human disconnection. So I made the choice to not respond to the environment at all. It was challenging at times, because there'll be times where like kids group come in and they'll make jokes and they'll say something, and sometimes that shit's really funny, and I try not to be available to that. But I just thought it was important, like, not to, connect with the audience in that way, to give them more opportunity to find their way into the meditation and start to like maybe get some sense of like where they are and how comfortable they are with in humanity, publicly and privately.
Did you have any interaction with people, or not interaction, but a reaction from people who felt entitled to some sort of response from you?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's quite consistent, you know, where people would come and ask questions and expect a response. And I think as a part of the didactic at the museum, there was a sign that said, do not expect a response, you know, just to make it clear. Because I think what had happened is like over time, the piece evolved, and this is something I love about like durational performances that happens over time, because the more you put it out in relationship to the audience, the more the audience makes it their own. And it ended up becoming a shrine for people to process or experience or pay homage to ancestral pains. This is a pain, you know. So there were people who came in from the indigenous community in Washington, D.C. I had some Piscataway descendants come and actually do drumming in the museum at the time, and some vocalizations. There were some people that came in from Australia, and they had paid some homage to the indigenous, Maori people in New Zealand, as well as the indigenous groups in Australia. And there was like reading poetry, singing songs, and anything like that. And most of those people they just wanted to posit something. You know, they didn't necessarily want to take anything. But like a lot of people whose practices are historically extractive wanted to take something with them, you know. And no matter how they loosely disguised it, I understood it as like they wanted some kind of, they wanted some way to make sense of this and to make themselves feel good. And I think that's just like was a very important choice for me as the artist, to not allow them to come in that space so they can say they feel good about something, or they can disconnect themselves from something because it wasn't them, it was their grandfather, their great-grandfather. And people did come in and try to use that, and usually those are the people who were demanding some kind of response.
As you would expect. Can you tell us about some of the symbols and signifiers that you're using in this film, and what they mean literally and what they mean figuratively, maybe from the rice, the vessel, the suit, the body, and the setting?
So the setting, which was, I think probably it was the most powerful performance environment I've ever had the experience of being in.
It doesn't look real.
Yeah. It doesn't look real, but boy, does it feel real. I had another way when I went in unprepared. I had not performed in a space that was that connected to that much pain and brutality. And something that's real about performances is, I think the biggest, the strongest of them, most difficult part of the performance is opening up your own body to certain frequencies that, most of us navigate the days without being open to, and certain sensibilities and connections to nature. And to be that open a portal in a space of that much pain, during that video, I whited out twice.
What do you mean by whited out?
I lost all sight. Everything went white.
Mm.
It's just white. Which I guess is the opposite of like blacking out. Everything turns black, but literally everything had turned white. And I was unsure if I was going to make it. But like even beyond that, I had difficulty breathing for that entire day. And I couldn't figure out exactly where that struggle for breath came from, and I can't help but connect it to the history of possibly being near, because I was surrounded by oaks. Some you might see in the video at certain times, but I don't think it would be hard to believe that one of those trees were used to end someone's life. And a part of that energy and a part of that portal is just something I've always experienced, and all of my work is when you open yourself to those kinds of transmissions, historically, you do not get to choose what comes in. So, I mean, there are times where I am working towards something and I can't sleep. I get visions, and that really manifested itself in this performance that day in ways where, there was, I took no bathroom breaks on that day, but there was one point where I did ask John to cut the camera, and I asked him to have Tamar come to the site and sing, because I just felt that the immediate energy around me was at great unrest with my presence. And for some reason, I thought that that was the only thing that could soothe them. So she came and she sang.
Wow. And I was going to ask this later, but that answers the question. Was Tamar involved in the actual performance, or did she score this afterwards?
Yeah, she was very involved. Yeah. So Tamar and John are both Gullah Geechee descent as well too.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the first opportunity I got to work with fellow Gullah Geechee artists. And they came down, they scouted. I took them to the space, we walked around, we felt the energy. And then, trusting them as artists, they all spent their own time with the space, to figure out what their contribution to the work would look like and feel like and sound like. Because it was definitely a part of their process as well too, because they were connected to people in that land, in that region.
I believe that comes across just intuitively to the viewer as well. You can feel the connection with the score to the piece, to the land, to the culture. It's beautiful. So back to that question, your costume choice, was that just because a black suit is easy, or was there something more behind that?
So it's a part of my language and my expression as an artist since I first started doing performance artwork, I think like in 2012. One thing I was really interested in is looking at the historic black male figure in the United States, and the power of the dressing and the presentation of those bodies. And it's just like a consistent through line that there's a sense of power and respect and responsibility in the black suit, the white shirt, the black tie. Steeply rooted in the civil rights movement and a lot of the faces that you saw in the civil rights movement. And for me, it was, it's part uniform, it's part armor. Being, particularly growing up as a little black gay sissy boy, and the rural South, there were challenges to me accessing my own power, my own identity, and any way that I could circumnavigate that, I was willing to participate in. I think in some of that at the expense of my own personality and my own reality for myself. But I realized I have a job to do. And in order for me to do that job as an artist, I really needed to declutter the conversations. I needed to edit the conversations that I was having in the world. And I didn't want, my sexuality to cloud the conversations, to misguide the conversations on the part of others, not myself. And I know that this is just an unfortunate reality. Because if I weren't able to edit that conversation, it'd be so hard for people to receive. And I feel like I have a responsibility and an obligation bigger than myself to make sure that I communicate the message that I've been charged to share with the world. And the black suit and the white tie serves as respectability, and I use it in that way, just to make sure that I can, reach people who may not be able to be reached or respond if too much of one thing came out in the conversation, too much of myself came out in that conversation the one way. because these conversations I have, they're not overtly black or gay or from a they're human. You know, they're very, very basic, and you know, I use the Maslow's hierarchy of needs as a reference for the foundation of most of my work. And you know, we all have one common need. If I'm going to have a conversation about humanity, sometimes you have to unfortunately be less human to communicate that, because human beings and human condition is a very difficult thing sometimes, and we just all know that communication fails sometimes when we allow ourselves to be all the bad things that are about us, quote unquote.
So beyond those elements that we spoke of earlier, there's also the you bring in historical documents and photographs. Can you talk about what those are? Are those ancestral photographs, or where did those images come from?
So they all came from the archive in Brooklyn. So in those moments, which I think it's a 7-minute cadence, every 7 minutes we flip to that. One thing I was really interested in when I was talking about like number one man, I was really interested in if there were any depictions of that body, or if there were any opportunities for some real portraiture. Because when you're talking about, you know, portraiture, I think in the traditional sense, obviously people who were enslaved did not have the luxury of that. So I was looking at ways that, you know, they were documenting black bodies back then. And, you know, there's some photos, but I think the pervasive mode of documentation was transactional, which I was like, well, this is the truth. You know, so a lot of those papers that you see are receipts and transactions, and you know, and kind of a inventory of chattel. You know, first names, you know, boy, child, is one, and they call the list of Negro children, where we believe my great-great-grandfather Peter was on that list. And then other ways that you saw documentations and names and any kind of like, you know, depiction of those people was like Peter, 2 blankets, a hoe, a shovel, ox and cart. It was just like everything that was loaned to them, or everything that they were working with, and when it came back. And then there was some documentation in there from post Civil War, where you started to see the first receipts for people who were formerly enslaved now getting paid for the work that they did. So then it became like an accounting ledger. And then just a few moments where you see some photos that were taken by, you know, folks who came in and, you know, just documenting the people. And, you know, my great-grandmother is in that series, and there's a point where it's a split screen, it's like me and her, and we share the same hairline.
I heard you say that in the gallery. I found it really interesting.
Yeah, and I thought that was a really important moment. You know, when we edited it, I was like, you know what, because like, you know, it's a slippery slope when you're working in like restorative history and working with like the historical fact, because, you know, people like to put those things in very comfortable spaces. It's like, oh, that's what it was. So, you know, for me, that was kind of just like a little cheeky way or cheating a little bit to directly connect that history to the vessel that you're seeing right now.
Well, that kind of brings me to my next question. Is this work a memorial, a meditation, or a confrontation? And by that I mean a memorial to your ancestors, a meditation on the humanity of enslavement, or a confrontation with the flawed narrative of slavery and the lasting impact and still living remnants of that inhuman institution? Or is it all of that?
It's a meditative confrontation couched in a memorial. You know, because I think what's real important, for me to determine the success of the work is how it functions on all three of those planes. The meditation race, I think, which is really when I'm thinking of time as material. The meditation, the 12 and a half hours, which I would just love for an opportunity to have an audience. I'll wait.
Here comes the audience.
Okay, yeah. This is a parade? Oh, okay, so less cultural. Okay. It's good, we editing this.
Right.
But yeah, I really like the opportunity to one day have the audience spend the entire 12 and a half hours out there. Because that's a real connection. It's like, I think to feel that, to have that transfer, to really be in this space where I think most of us are privileged now to pass time, to contrast that to the difference of time passing. Because that's something I really became intimately aware of, is like time passing versus passing time. And time passing is a very, 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 it's just, like, I totally lost sense of time while in the museum. Like, I had no idea. One of the things that actually the museum's technical team did is they set the lighting to mimic the movement of the sun. So it was the only indication that I had of like the passage of time. It's like looking at the light and trying to figure out the light. And I think by the 7th day I could really figure out like when I was towards the end of the day based on the lighting.
Wow.
But yeah, I think that that for the meditative part, it really is the time. And and the thing about the film is like, I hope it works too. Like, even if you don't spend the 12 hours, like if you come and you sit down with 12 seconds, that would be enough of a meditation for you to understand. The memorial like physically sits at the bottom of the film. The catafalque with the burlap and the rice, and like looking at what represents the body. I think is just this beyond the act of actually doing the performance and spending that time. That memorial feels very powerful and poignant and connected to me. And I hope that whatever audience come and experience that, they see that. Because if you sit there, there's a reason why there's a poetry in that. There's a reason why I chose to put it on a catafalque as opposed to just any kind of other structure, and the reason why it lays out that way. And then the confrontation, the confrontation can begin in the piece, but it can't end there. The idea is like you hope you get the confrontation and you take it with you, and it becomes a part of your practice, and you internalize it. Because the thing that I don't want to happen is like for people to come and expect the confrontation to be contained in the piece, because then that would suggest some pathway to resolution in the piece, and there is none. And it's not designed to be that way. You can find your path there, but the work and your destination has to be beyond that piece. So I would hate to set it up that way, but I hope it certainly invites the confrontation and the subsequent conversation.
Well, I have not had the opportunity to spend serious time in the space yet. We just opened this, but I can say that the longer I spend with it, the more deeply I seem to feel it. It's not a piece that you can watch 30 seconds of and understand. I think I don't even fully understand it yet because I haven't spent enough serious time with the piece. Time seems to be deeply part of it, part of the narrative. So how was the piece received as a film at the National Portrait Gallery for the 2019 exhibition?
I feel pretty good. about how that transpired, and I tell you, like, the indicators that I have is there were times where I would walk into the portrait gallery, and security staff would come up to me and say, I was in your room last week, and I had, some say I've never seen myself reflected in the museum in that way, which is a very powerful thing, because this is the kind of this is the canon of American portraiture, and then they would also share anecdotes of like how other parts of the viewing public came, and I think initially in the exhibition setup there were no benches, there were no places for people to sit. And then after, some audience suggestion, like they put some benches down in front of the piece, and people actually would spend time, and people would actually come at different times of the day to experience, maybe an hour later in the day, because it would automatically start on sunrise, whatever day that was. And then people learn the rhythm of the piece and would come at certain times of the day just to see what the body is doing at that time. And the one thing that I think was real powerful, but like sort of hard to understand, is one of the guards came and she told me, she's like, there's a period in the film where it's just a close-up of the face and the blue sky in the backdrop, and it's very still, like there's very still movement, like you could see me breathing, you could see the blank of the eye to realize it was it was not a fixed image. And she said that she never wants to do a shift again during that part of the video, because she said it was too much for her to see that. And she meant it in a very complimentary way. It wasn't, it wasn't an elevated, curatorial, like conversation about it. But what she really communicated is at that moment, it was too much for her to bear the history. And she was a Black woman, and I was okay with that, because I have no intentions of making you as a Black woman feel the pressure to bear of this narrative, because you've already done enough. Mm-hmm. So, I really appreciate the way that the work has been experienced. The thing that I would like most for this piece is to be as public and accessible, for it to become that way. I really appreciated the way that people turned the performance into a shrine and started to bring things. And as a part of now the traveling exhibition with Outland, all of those things now have been assumed, are just folded into the display now. So things that people have brought, are now part of the traveling exhibition. Mm. So now the community is directly contributing to that conversation and that work in a way, and we plan on keeping those things. I would love to see that also happen here as well too, as the audience see fits, if they want to continue to contribute that.
As an organic process.
Mm-hmm.
Do you believe, since you initially made this piece, that the context of the work has changed? I mean that in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, and especially the murder of Ahmaud Arbery, who had ties to Gullah Geechee culture, and the reaction that America has had to those murders, do you believe that that has affected the viewing of the piece, the context of the work at all?
I think so. And not in a way that's like too aspirational, but I do think, the context of like working and restoring historical narratives, like people realize the power of that. I like to think of my work to be Afrofuturist at the same time, but not in a way that I think most people think of Afrofuturism. You know, it's like even like the medium and the way that I work and the, you know, the subject matter that I mind. But I think that our future is critical on understanding the truth of our history. I just don't think that we will ever evolve as a society if we continue to live in revisionist historical narratives. If we refuse to teach our children about the truth of the foundation and the formation of this country, if we don't do any of that work, it seems like everything else is futile. Because, I mean, if you think about it very pragmatically, you know, like we're continuing trying to build this mansion on a destabilized foundation. We just don't, you know, if you look at, you know, the building, the space that we're in right now, you know, if the foundation of this place is, if it's not situated, then, you know, how will you go through with your expansion? It would be a folly, you know, because it would all fall down. And I feel like, as basic as that sound, that is really the truth. If we don't understand from the genocidal founding of this country, you know, with the rape and the pillaging of the indigenous people who were here, all the way up to these brutalist capitalist structures that we have right now, if we don't rectify those things, if we don't bring truth to those things, everything that we put on top would just be just would be a lost cause. So, and that's what I hope that my work actually does have an impact on the future. You know, not just for people of African descent in this country, but for everybody.
That's a beautiful answer. And final question for you, before we open it up to some questions from our limited audience today. How does it feel having this work in New Orleans? Is there any significance to that to you?
Yeah, tremendous significance to this. You know, when we talk about like Gullah Geechee culture and, you know, the recent preservation efforts of this, you know, I think for me, like stepping into that identity fully was largely informed by being exposed to Creole culture here in New Orleans. Because I remember when I first saw that or experienced that, like we didn't have cable TV or anything like that growing up, but in some way I got introduced to the cultures here. And, you know, I could hear that same, you know, it's not the same dialect, but, you know, you can hear those same tones in the language, in the people from this region that we spoke in Gullah Geechee. And then I could tell that everyone in that space had an affinity for that. People liked the people who loved it, you know. But when we were doing the same thing, you know, like when I grew up, you know, I was always taught that I was language deficient, you know, because we spoke a certain way. And it wasn't until I was exposed to this, that I realized that I was actually bilingual, that I actually was fully functional at the highest levels of two languages. And there was no appreciation for one. And it really helped to contextualize, because like the Gullah Geechee preservation effort is maybe 16 years old now. You know, since we got a designation from the National Park Service, and it's like, this is the corridor, and everything in the corridor now is going to be protected. And now there's so much conversation around, you know, this collective need to preserve this beautiful culture from the Barrier Islands and the coastal Southeast. So, you know, having an exhibition like this here, you know, kind of helps to bring the work full circle. You know, I think that there's just a lot of you know, valuable infrastructure and cultural practices that come from this region that can really help us to preserve our dying language and culture. You know, just in ways that we just at one point didn't even know that we were at risk. You know, and I think that we share a lot of, you know, the same risk in terms of like being, you know, like we're in Hurricane Alley. we have this very weird structure called heirs property, where no one really owns the property. So if, something comes through and there's a hurricane, we couldn't even access FEMA assistance because the land ownership is, and it's ambiguous.
Right.
And and we are at threat of losing, the land, which just like here is the foundation of the culture. So without that, there is no more culture. So I look forward to the duration of this exhibition really being a conversation where there could be great exchange between these two Creole cultures in the United States. And maybe we can glean from the successes that you all have had and helping us to protect what we have.
Well, I'm really interested to see the people of New Orleans, the community here, and the children, the school kids of New Orleans, engage with this piece and see how it speaks to them and what that dialogue might be. It's a huge honor for the Ogden Museum, as I said, to be a steward of this work, and I'm very excited to present what I consider to be one of the most significant acquisitions that the museum has made in its history. So thank you for, first and foremost, putting your body out there and your mind out there to make the work. We're very excited about it. So with that, any questions from the audience? Yes.
We've actually lived in DC for quite some time, and I understand we're from here. We lived in DC for quite some time, and what we lovingly refer to as the golden period, and we left it for a minute. We came out, but we, having seen similarities and yet differences, it brings back to me going to the Smithsonian. I was blessed enough not to work very far away from there. It was always striking to me when you brought up the security guards, because they're all of color, all of them. And I feel the need to, I have a question, but I feel the need to say that for everyone in this room, that they are all of color when you walk in. And it's a sea of a non-colored audience, because you're in an international space in the Smithsonian. So you're having people come in and out from all over the place. It's a big museum, it's federal ground, and yet everyone who's in there is a color watching and walking around, moving within that space. And so I love the fact that you spoke to their experience, because I think the audience experience there is very varied. My question is, coming here, and I'm not sure here how different the audience is going to be, but I presume it's very from DC. But how do you feel the audience is different beyond culturally, but just how the audience may receive it here, or that kind of conversation may be different being viewed here than in DC?
Well, I would hope for that. Unfortunately, I don't know a lot about the audience. This is my first real time in New Orleans. I only drove through.
And just for the sake of the video, I'm not sure that your question was recorded, so the question is, how will the audience differ? And please continue, sorry for the interruption.
Sorry, repeat the question. It's like I don't know enough about the New Orleans audience. Like, what I would really hope for is, an audience that is, so adjacent to a similar culture might see, some of the stream of thought coming through that. I think, it's a very bright and big, thing. And, I hope what they see is like how the history of agriculture, and, what that has meant for them, because they have that same brutal agricultural history. And then, maybe see or hear or feel how these different microcultures within this country, have existed and are under threat in different ways. And being in a place like, I went to Congo Square yesterday and, feeling that energy, I would hope a city like, New Orleans, which definitely is a portal, I feel like that audience would maybe come through with that point of view and come through with that lens and probably experiences were completely different than, a regular Washington tourist who may not have the context, who may not really understand, who probably have never heard of Gullah Geechee culture before, or even be the type of person who would challenge my Americanness because, they hear my accent, it's like, well, you can't be from here. When I'm actually from here, and, probably much longer than the person who's asking me family's been here. My family has been here. So, I would be very excited, I think, in some continued conversations to hear how the New Orleans audience is experiencing responding or experiencing the piece, because, there's some nuance that probably they would be out of any other community in the United States, that they would be able to pick up on that nuance probably better than anyone else.
It seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that New Orleans and Gullah Geechee culture share something that maybe the rest of the country does not quite have, is the level of cultural retention among Black people.
Mm-hmm.
That I think because Louisiana was French and Spanish rather than American, the enslaved people were considered humans and not chattel until the Americans took over. And in Gullah Geechee, was it their isolation on the barrier islands where it afforded them more freedom to retain cultural practices, their own languages, their own religious practices, etc. So I think these two places are very sacred within Black culture and American history.
Absolutely.
And I hope that resonance is felt by showcasing this work. Any other questions?
Yeah, I had a question kind of related to both process and result. Because he mentioned your background earlier as a psychologist, and I didn't know if and you may have already answered it with your description earlier, if it was, the process was more of kind of taking up these Jungian archetypes and kind of assuming that mantle, or was it more of a focus on kind of that moving meditation, and then how did that process affect the results? Did the meditative practice itself inform you, the art, the environment, and kind of what stuck out to you at the end of the process?
Repeat the question.
Yeah. I'm not sure I can repeat the
wasn't
question.
sure, if you were more coming kind of like from a
Oh, no.
Jungian
I got you. No, for the camera. He's going to repeat
So
it.
I believe your question is, where did you approach this concept with these ideas of the Jungian archetype, and you were going to embody that? And did that come from your medical practice prior to?
Well, no, I'm not a medical, I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm a psychotherapist, but I'm definitely a Jungian, so I think that's very keen that you picked up on that. We won't get into Freudian ideology, but I do feel like Freudian ideology is very displacing. It's like, how do you remove responsibility? And I feel like something that's been very, practical and pragmatic about Jungian approaches to it. It's like, where is the shared responsibility? For me, it's like, as a therapist, the conversation was all about understanding the environment that you're in, taking that into consideration, and how do I help offer you a pathway to your own restoration. So, if I had to put it in that same way, this would kind of look like what a treatment plan would be for, a very, very, very deep rooted psychological condition of the American psyche, So definitely bringing some of those principles and those structures. However, I don't take it too far, because there's, there's a lot of, colonized infrastructure in traditional psychotherapy, which is something I've come to realize. So I have to be very mindful of that, because, again, that transaction that I had with the guard, it's like, we can't continue to put burden on Black people to fix the problems that white people and white supremacists created. The challenge is, create that conversation, understand the humanity of these people, and then where the responsibility lies. So, I think to answer your question, yes, that's very much a part of it. the meditation, which is not a traditional like Eastern healing practice, bringing that into, I'm sorry, not a Western traditional practice, but bringing in that idea of like meditation and what it means to spend time with an idea, spend time with the concept, and those ideas and concepts hopefully are contained within that work, and people can glean that and see that and take that on. But again, like, I told the line at the work actually being prescriptive, because that's unfair to the work, and it's not the work's job.
So we should not use a treatment plan for the American psyche as
You
a
should
new
not.
subtext.
You should not, but that's just the intention of what's going on behind,
Any other questions? Yes.
Let me know if you can't hear me.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Can you hear me right now?
I can hear you now.
Okay,
Mhm.
awesome. I've been thinking about this book by Kevin Quashie, The Sovereignty of Quieted, and a lot about Khoisan, Khoisan's opacity, while you've been talking, and I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the work's relationship to privacy, or your relationship to maybe you and the work's relationship to privacy, because I think there's like a lot about public opacity that's like really important and apparent, but I'm wondering where maybe some significance for like some type of internal, I guess, experience. I'm like curious about that. But then also I'm asking you in a public space like a question about
And you mean
about privacy, but
my privacy? Are you talking, or you mean like the privacy like I would expect or be interested in for the viewer?
I think I'm interested in like any interpretation of
Okay.
that. Yeah.
So I'll start off with this. I feel like the foundation of my practice is very cathartic. Like when I started storytelling, which was like my initial creative expression, it was a part of my own healing process. And the simple way that I would do that is I would take these like very private moments, which I think of in two ways. They were events, and then those events later became experiences as I reflected on them and contextualized them. And in these stories I would tell about growing up in the rural South as a little black gay sissy boy, like it was always like the biggest part of the arc was like from the time the event became an experience, and how I thought of like something happening when someone called me a faggot, or I used to do this thing called I'm a faggot, I'm proud, and my uncle used to pay me $0.25 to perform that in front of people. And I remember the last time I did it, my mother beat me that night because I had embarrassed her in front of like the new pastor. So those very private moments are really foundational to work. I feel like that's how, like, when I'm thinking about making it work and I'm thinking about my responsibility to put something out there, if I cannot connect it to something that's meaningful to me, which is usually very private, then I won't touch it. Because I feel like I could not contribute responsibly to that narrative. So, for this piece, I think in terms of privacy, for me, a lot of that has to do with the rectification of like my own assumed privilege, which I know I do have a relative privilege, because it was, something that I always reminded myself when I was doing the work. As painful and distraught I was, I knew that at any time I could get up and get out of that field. I know that anytime if like I needed to use the bathroom and I wanted the comfort of actually using a bathroom and not using the bathroom on myself, I had that. So, so I think privately, I don't know the book that you referenced, but I think I understand like where you're coming from. It's like how that translates in the work. But I think for me, I would hope that those kind of vulnerable moments, because You know, the thing that people sometimes ask me, you know, and they usually ask me this privately, which is very funny. Like, people won't ask me, like, how did I survive without eating? People won't ask me how I used the bathroom while I did that publicly. Like, I've never had anyone ask me that question in public. But I guarantee you, within 5 minutes of the end of the talk, and I stepping out the door, and it's like, well, how did you eat? Did you use the bathroom? And I happily share, I said, yes, I used the bathroom on myself. I had to, you know. So, you know, and I think in those moments, then that conversation now becomes, you know, you transfer this like context of privacy from me to the audience. And for me, that's all I need to do, you know, because, you know, if I can make someone really understand, you know, what it could have been like, you know, not having the choice to use the bathroom or go to eat when you need to, or, you know, or even like just not having a good night's sleep. You know, because there was one moment during the performance, maybe like day 6 or 7, where I thought I was falling into hysteria because I could not hear the sound of the museum, the exhibition, for hours. All night I heard, because there were like 3 video pieces that I could hear, you know, while I'm in this meditation, one of which being mine. And I could not unhear it. I'd never experienced anything like that before in my life. But the sound was so present in my being, I could not sleep. And I was like, if this continues, I can't make it. But, you know, I hope in sharing these kinds of like private moments and these real private stressors, it bolsters not the work itself, but the impact of the work. I hope that answered your question.
Any other questions? Well,
I just have
one more.
I was about to say, it's going to be the end. I'm going to ask this one at the end because it's not quite about the piece. You mentioned your grandmother is in that kind of tourist position, is how I'll call it, because we actually do have a similarity here in New Orleans. We have a lot of cemeteries that are open to tourists and groups that maybe they're not even paid. There's people who go in and give tours. We have a relative buried there actually recently, and so we are literally burying and grieving, and there are tourists walking through. And that's the closest to performance art I've ever gotten. People just stop and stare at you. And so I just wanted to get your take when you start getting into preservation work, which we deal with quite a bit in New Orleans, your concept of having your grandmother there, you know, not as personal as you'd like to get, but just a conversation of when you're preserving that area and having people kind of on display, but with the benefit of, this is our culture. So we need to have that, but this is our culture. And there's someone deceased in that position, and people that are still alive that are grieving them.
Yeah. No, that's, you know, I mean, I think that's a part of the price to pay, the price that we all pay for these things. Because, you know, I tell people, like, they ask me, like, how did I end up growing up there, and, you know, how did I end up accessing, like, all of these resources, and, like, being able to shoot in, you know, in the same rice field, you know, where my, you know, where my people labored. And that's because we were preservation adjacent. You know, had this like rich white couple not come down from Boston, the Huntingtons, and buy up 4 plantations, Springfield, the Oaks, Brook Green, like we were sitting on some of the most valuable land in South Carolina. You know, there's like riverfront, waterfront property, and if it wasn't for that huge preservation effort, we wouldn't be there. Like, you know, that film would have never been made, you know, because it would be someone's 7th or 8th hole on the golf course. And, you know, and we can see that as, you know, the place that I live that's still called the Village is being encroached, you know, like we are surrounded, you know, by multi-million-dollar homes in every direction. And you know, the only reason we would be able to fight that or to stave that off is because, you know, Brook Green Garden has massive endowments, and they have, you know, hundreds of thousands of acres that they will never sell. So, you know, and yeah, it's, you know, is it disquieting? You know, like if I go to my grandmother's grave and there's like one of those big, you call those things, those like amphibian, those ducks. You know, and the duck tour goes by, you know, while you're trying to have this moment with your family, you know, it's a small price to pay. But like every now and again, I do like to disrupt the docents there, because there's like a bunch of docents who are like all retired people from the Northeast. And you know, they'll be coming and telling tours, and like one time me and my mom was on the boat, and I was like, that's my mother's grave, that's my mother's grave right there. And they're like, wait, what do you mean? You mean your mother? I was like, no. Like literally, that's my grandmother's, one removed right here, you know. And just to contextualize, because you know, for that small group of tourists, like they actually get to see the more direct connection that, you know, we have to this country's history, which people are constantly trying to pull apart.
Right.
So I'll take it to answer your question.
Yes.
So as an artist, you get this inspiration to do your piece, and we've learned how that develops. Is there an unexpected creativity or inspiration that came after the actual performance for you? Was there something that changed from the original inspiration or changed you internally just by going through the actual performance process of your vision?
You know, the thing that performance like really provides an opportunity to, like, you know, when I'm talking about like opening up, being open to the portal, you know, it's like when I was training for theater there, they tell you like 90. I love this kind of shit, mind you. So I'm a gearhead, so I was like, you know, I love that, so I don't mind it at all. But it takes like 90-10, like, you know, 90% you're in the character and 10% you're actually, you know, the actor. That way, like if a chair falls over, like the character may not respond to that, but the actor needs to respond to that and actually pick up that chair. You know, I feel like with performance, it's like 99.99999, and just like a small percentage of that. You know, there's a point in the film, a couple of points in the film where, you know, we talk about the relationship of nature and the incredible practice of nature just kind of absorbing my body in that space after being there so long. You know, there's a part in the film where you can actually see like 1 million fire ants like right at my knees. And anyone who's familiar with fire ants know that you don't do anything to provoke them. They just come ready to fight and bite. And there were just 1 million of them there, and not a single one stung me. Not a single fire ant. There's another moment in the film where I got my head down and I noticed some movement on the corner of my eyes. And I look up and there's just like these beautiful aubergine, like perfect eggplant, like stick legs, you know, and it's just like white crane that just walked into the frame during the meditation. Like I had never, I was just so struck by the color of their legs. I had no idea. You know, you look at it far, you think it's black, but it's really a beautiful aubergine. And it's right there in the frame with me for minutes. You know, I imagine it doesn't have that perpetuity to human conditions, because it's not like they're tourists there or anything like that, and they're feeding them on like seagulls. And then there's a moment at the end of the film, which is, you know, very rarely seen, because usually by the time the film is reaching sunset, the museum's closed and people have been shuffled out. But there's a grasshopper that spends the last hour on my shoulder. And it stayed there until we were done shooting and we got out. But, you know, I had to be available and open to those moments, you know, and, you know, I had to, like, honor some response some way. Like, you know, I didn't have to do anything. I didn't have to move out of the way, you know, I was just there. But, you know, I had to be cognizant that at some point, if these fire ants do start to sting me, that I would have to get up. But yeah, you know, like performance does allow for that, and I think, you know, I think it's part of the beauty of the ephemeral practice. Is it can be that, it can do that, and like I said about the performance that lasted over several days, you know, people would come back to the performance and read and sing and leave things, and yeah, I think that's the beauty of having a practice built that way, is there is a lot of room for the audience to tap in.
Any other questions? Thank you, members of the audience, for coming out and giving up your Sunday for this wonderful talk. And at home, if you're interested in supporting the Ogden Museum of Southern Art and our endeavors here, go to ogdenmuseum.org, and you can also learn more about Sheldon Scott's installation currently on view. And thank you so much, Sheldon,
Thank you.
for the work and for being here with us today.